Brene Brown is a research professor at the University of Houston. She works in the fields of empathy and reconciliation and a lot of psychological fields. She also tends to blame people for her problems, which is something I think we all can relate with. And she tells a story at the beginning of one of her presentations about a time where she shuffled into the kitchen one morning to get a cup of coffee to wake up before heading off to the shower. That was her typical morning routine. But on this particular morning, she felt herself dragging a little bit. So she needed that extra shot of caffeine. She went into the kitchen for a second cup of coffee, and that's where everything went wrong. Because the coffee mug tumbled out of her hand, it shattered on the kitchen floor into a million pieces, and brown coffee splashed all over her white slacks and pink sweater, which I'll tell you, I didn't realize I had dressed like Brene Brown until I got on stage for service this morning. That was kind of awkward. But anyway, she splashed coffee all over herself, and without hesitation, the first words that came out of her mouth were, "Dang you, Steve." Now, Steve is Brene's husband. Steve likes to play water polo with his friends one night a week. Usually he gets home about 10 p.m., but on this particular occasion, he didn't get home until 10:30. So Brene had stayed up a little bit later, waiting for him to get home, therefore didn't get as much sleep. Ergo, this is all Steve's fault, that she was tired and needed that second cup of coffee, and now it broke and it's all over her clothes. She tends to blame people for her problems. Now, can anybody relate with that logic in here? I see some of you are laughing a little bit, a couple people. It's kind of funny the extent we'll go to try to blame other people for our problems, isn't it? But the reality is, if we were to take a step back, just like Brene, we'd realize that's not Steve's fault that I'm clumsy. Just like it's not our fault, right? Or it's not their fault that there's a little bit of friction in our relationship or we got into that argument or whatever. The reality is, it's just easier to blame people than to assume the rather uncomfortable vulnerability it takes to admit, maybe I'm not an innocent dove in this scenario myself. Blame is easy. We're continuing a series today. This is part 2 of 4 in a series called Family Friction. You know, Christmas time is supposed to be the most wonderful time of the year where we get together with family and friends and they make a Hallmark movie about how wonderful it is. The reality, though, is that for some of us, family gatherings and family time are great. But for some of us, family gatherings and family time can be really challenging because not all of our families are this perfect amalgam of perfect people. Sometimes there are words that have been said in the past or arguments that have taken place or things that have been done, and there's friction in our relationships with our siblings, with our parents, with our extended family, whatever. Sometimes there's a lot of friction in our family. But what we're hearing in last week's message, in this message, in every message, part of the series, is that God's grace can go a long way in helping us overcome these hard holidays if we can learn to live in it and extend it to others. And today we're talking about blame. It is easier to blame people. Brene, she blamed Steve for her mug of coffee, but she came to realize it wasn't entirely his fault. And today, as we start to look at the family friction in our lives, we're going to assume a rather humble posture. And we're going to admit, it might not be entirely their fault that there's this friction. I may have had a part to play in it as well. And to guide us in this rather humbling journey, we're going to be looking at the life of a man named Jacob. And Jacob's story begins in the book of Genesis, chapter 25. So if you've got your Bibles, I want to encourage you to open those up to Genesis 25. If you don't have your Bible or you can't see it, you can look at the screens to the side, or you can download the YouVersion Bible app on your mobile device and follow along there. That's what I'll be doing this morning. So we're going to start off with this idea that might be a little hard to swallow at first, but we're just going to jump in with both feet, okay? Seldom is there only one party to blame when it comes to family friction. Now, there are some exceptions, okay? In a case of abuse or something like that, you didn't do anything to deserve that. That really is the other person's fault. But in most instances of family friction, there is seldom just one party to blame, okay? It takes two to tango. It takes two to argue. And we start to see that when we look at the life of Jacob. Now, Jacob, right from the get-go, was kind of an instigator. Like he was kind of a weaselly guy. He was a deceiver. In fact, his name, Jacob, literally it means heel grabber. When he came out of the womb, he was a twin. His older brother Esau, he was the firstborn. But Jacob wasn't going to take it lying down. As soon as he came out, he reached out and grabbed Esau's heel. And so they gave him the name heel grabber. In Hebrew culture, that's kind of an idiom for a deceiver. The way that today, if somebody can't keep a secret, we call them a big mouth. Back then, you call them a heel grabber if they were kind of dishonest and a cheat. So right from the get-go, he receives this name, deceiver, and it kind of sticks with him for the rest of his life and kind of sets the course for his life. Because Jacob, time and time again, is going to kind of be this instigator towards his brother. And there's this story in Genesis 25 that illustrates this. Let's look at verse 29. Okay, it goes like this. Once when Jacob was cooking some stew, Esau, his brother, came in from the open country, famished. He said to Jacob, "Quick, let me have some of that red stew. I'm famished." And that's why he was also called Edom. Now, Edom, it means red. Esau, he was known for having red hair, so this guy's nickname is Red, and everything about him is red, and so that's kind of a Hebrew joke. Jacob replied, "First, sell me your birthright." "Look, I'm about to die," Esau said. "What good is a birthright to me?" But Jacob said, "Swear to me first." So he swore an oath to him, selling his birthright to Jacob. Then Jacob gave Esau some bread and some lentil stew. He ate and drank, and then got up and left. And so Esau despised his birthright. So a little bit of clarity here. In Hebrew culture, this ancient culture, if you had two children, okay, depending on how many kids you had, the oldest born would receive double the inheritance of all the others. So in this case, there are two boys. The estate would have been split in thirds. Jacob would have got 1/3. Esau would have gotten 2/3. Sorry, Charlie, that's just the way it works. But Jacob, he's got a plan. He says, I am going to secure for myself an abundance of wealth. I'm going to pull one over on Esau. And so Esau comes in one day. He's kind of a man's man. He's a hunter. He's just this big, burly, redheaded guy. He comes in. He says, I am about to fall over dead. I'm so hungry. And Jacob's just sitting here just stirring this delicious stew, like blowing the fumes over at Esau, like, oh, really? Like, whoa. And so he says, here's the deal. I'll give you some stew, but you got to sell me your share of the inheritance. Now, Jacob's kind of being opportunistic here. He knows Esau's starving. We get the impression Esau may not be the brightest crayon in the box either because he's pretty easy to fool. But Jacob, he says, give me your inheritance and I'll give you some stew. And he takes advantage of his brother to secure for himself this birthright, this inheritance. And Esau does it. And we might look at this situation. This is going to cause a lot of friction in their family in the future, by the way. We might look at this situation and say, well, Jacob's really kind of the weasel here. This is really all his fault. It'd be easy just to say he bears all the blame. Because in reality, it's easiest just to blame one person when there's friction in a family. Case in point, my wife and I, a few weeks ago, we got into a bit of a tiff. I was in the kitchen doing dishes. She had just finished giving our son a bath and put him down, so she was taking a break in the living room. And she says from the living room, how do I turn the TV on? Now, we had just had a TV go out. We had an extra one from when we moved, so we put it up. And so that was a reasonable question. Here's the thing with this TV, though. There's only one button on it. It's a big circle button on the front of it. It's got the power symbol. And so when she says, how do I turn the TV on? My first thought is, push the power button. So I said that, thinking, well, that'll end the conversation. And that's where things took an unexpected turn, because she said, which one? What do you mean, which one? There's only one button. Just push it. So I thought for a moment, I'm like, can I clarify this in some way? Is there a way I can say this to where it maybe that was misleading? And I thought, no, I don't know of another way to say this. And so I said the same thing, push the power button. And again, she said, which one? What do you mean, which one? There's one button, just roll the dice and push it, see what happens. And so it went back and forth like this, and the conversation just got louder, but we kept saying the same thing. Which one? The power button. Which one? The power button. And we got into a bit of a tiff. Now, was she just being obnoxious? I didn't understand. It was really easy for me to look at this argument and be like, man, what is she doing here? It's all her fault. But seldom is there only one party to blame when it comes to family friction, remember? We look at the story of Jacob and Esau, and we can point to Jacob and we can say, man, he kind of is a deceiver and he pulled one over on his brother. But even the passage says Esau despised his birthright. He was careless. He didn't appreciate the value that both the religious and monetary heritage of his family carried. Jacob is the main perpetrator here, but he can't carry all the blame. Esau played his part as well. In that situation with my wife, I got tired of this push the power button, which one nonsense. And so I walked into the living room, and what I found was my wife looking at the universal remote, and everything clicked in my mind because we had just put this TV up on the wall. I hadn't had time to program it yet. And so she was looking at this remote with like 1,000 different buttons, none of which were going to work anyway, saying, which button do I push? And I just kept saying like a moron, just push the power button, right? And all of a sudden I realized we're just talking past each other. Now, did she help the situation by asking the same question over and over? No. But did I help the situation by giving the same answer over and over? No. There was plenty of blame to go around here for this miscommunication, but it required me to take a step back and look at it a little more carefully. The same thing happens in this Jacob and Esau story. When we take a step back, we realize Jacob's not the only guy to blame here. Esau's got some blame to carry as well. And when we take a step back from the emotion and the proximity of our own family friction, I'm pretty sure we'll see the same thing. It may feel like it's one person's fault, but the reality is we probably have some blame to carry as well. It may be a lot like Jacob, or it may be a little like Esau. Maybe we just said the wrong word, or maybe our anger showed more than we realized, or maybe our words stung more than we intended. Maybe we gave the wrong facial reaction, like our eyebrows went up when they weren't supposed to, or maybe it was the tone of voice that we used. Maybe we just asked the wrong questions. There's 100 different ways we may have contributed to this argument or to this friction or to this disunity, but the reality is, no matter how big or small it is a contribution. We all have a little bit of blame to shoulder in this, but seeing that and admitting it, well, it requires us to take a posture of humility. And humility is not always a comfortable posture to assume, but it is crucial. And this is really the whole point of this message. This is at the heart of it here. When it comes to family friction, humbling ourselves is the first step towards healing family friction. Humbling ourselves is the first step. It's not the only step, but it is the first step. It's what's going to get the ball rolling when it comes to healing family friction. And that's not just true of family relationships, by the way. That's true of any relationship. But we're in the context of family here today. And when we take a closer look at the rest of Jacob's story, we start to see how humility really brings reconciliation between these two brothers. Jacob is going to go on continuing in his path of deception and kind of hoodwinking, and it's going to all come home to roost one day because Esau is going to get fed up. There comes a time where their father is about to pass away. Their father's name is Isaac. And Isaac is very old, he can barely see, and he wants to bless his two sons before he departs. Now we have to realize that blessing in this culture, it was more than just words. It wasn't just a bunch of well wishes or I hope you do well. It was a powerful event. And it was also a finite thing, meaning if I gave a blessing, it was given. I can't just give that same blessing to somebody else. It's kind of like a ham sandwich. If I make a ham sandwich after church today and I eat it all, and I might think, that was really good, I can't eat that same sandwich on Monday. Once it's gone, it's gone. And the same thing is true with blessing. And so the day comes for the blessings to take place, and Jacob knows that Esau is going to get the better blessing. He's the oldest son. He's kind of dad's favorite son. And so Jacob, he disguises himself to look like Esau. Again, dad can't see very well. And he steals Esau's blessing. So when Esau hears this, understandably, he's pretty upset because this guy has now taken both his inheritance and his blessing from his father. And in fact, he gets so angry, he says in no uncertain terms, when dad is dead, I'm going to murder you. And that's not like an empty threat. This is, I will bathe my hands in your blood seriousness. Esau is furious. And so Jacob, in fear, he flees. He goes to live with his uncle on a far-off land, and he continues his life of deception and hoodwinking and so on. And time goes by. 20 years pass. And God says, okay, Jacob, it's time to go home. And Jacob's like, well, God, if I go home, Esau's going to kill me, right? And God's response is, we'll see, just trust me, it's time to go home. So Jacob, he gathers up, he has 2 wives at this point, he gathers them up. He has 2 concubines, he gathers them up. He's got 11 sons, he gathers them up. He's got a bunch of flocks and herds of animals. Everything he has, he starts his caravan home. And as he gets pretty close to the homeland, he sends a messenger ahead to Esau. And the messenger is basically to say this, your brother Jacob's coming, he doesn't want to fight, he's not trying to take your land, he just wants to come home. And when the messenger returns to Jacob, he says, well, Esau got the message, and he's coming to meet you. And he's bringing 400 guys with him. Now, 3 or 4 guys, that's a party. Like, that's a welcoming committee. 400 guys is what we call a platoon. And Jacob knows it. He thinks that Esau is still really upset about this whole stealing everything from him thing. And so he's terrified. And so he starts to send these gifts, wave after wave of herds of cattle and flocks of sheep, until Esau's almost inundated with these gifts. And then it gets the night before these two parties are going to collide on this pathway. And this is what we read. If you want to skip ahead a little bit to Genesis chapter 33, verse 22. It goes like this. That night Jacob got up and took his 2 wives, his 2 female servants, and his 11 sons, and he crossed the ford of the Jabbok. That's a river. After he had sent them across the stream, he sent over all his possessions. And so all of his animals, all of his stuff, they follow afterwards. And so Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him till daybreak. So let me paint you a picture of what's happened here, okay? Jacob is on one side of the river, and he sends his wives, his concubines, his sons, all of his cattle and his livestock, all of his stuff ahead of him, which means that in the morning, when his whole caravan is marching down the road and they come to blows with Esau, Jacob is going to be way in the back, safe and sound. He's got a whole family of human shields in front of him. He is the smartest guy in the room, but in a really terrible way. He's kind of a swindler, kind of a cheat, kind of a weasel. But then something happens that night. We read that there's this man that shows up and wrestles with Jacob. And I wish we had more time this morning to really just dive into this story, because it's kind of a neat encounter. But we're going to summarize and paraphrase just because this is kind of a long story and our time is limited. This man that assails Jacob in the dead of night is not an assassin, it's God in disguise. And Jacob, he wrestles with God all through the night. And really that's indicative of Jacob's entire life. His whole life, Jacob's been wrestling with God. He's never been the man he was called to be. He's never been a man of integrity. He's never been a man of patience. He cheats and he weasels and he deceives. And so this night, this is really just kind of a symbol of Jacob's whole life. And he wrestles and he wrestles and he wrestles, and until the sun's about to come up. And that's when God kind of just touches his hip and pops it out of socket. And Jacob is injured. You might say he's humbled to the point that the wrestling ceases. And when Jacob realizes, because no normal dude is just going to touch your hip and it pop out of socket, Jacob realizes this is somebody divine that I'm dealing with. He stops and he says, "Who are you? Will you bless me?" And God does bless him. He says, "Your name's Jacob, right? Well, no more. After this day, you will no longer be known as heel grabber. You're no longer going to be deceiver. Now your name is Israel. And that name, it means I've wrestled with man and God and I've overcome." And this isn't a name that says, "Woo, Jacob beat God in wrestling." Yeah, it's nothing like that. This is a name that was given to Jacob so he remembers this day and what happened. Because this is the day he was humbled and he found strength in God. And the blessing comes from God because he humbled himself before him. It's a day that changes Jacob in profound ways. And we see that as we keep reading the story. Look at chapter 33, verse 1. The very next day, Jacob looked up, and there was Esau, coming with his 400 men. And so Jacob divided the children among Leah and Rachel, those are his wives, and the 2 female servants. And he put the female servants and their children in front, and Leah and her children next, and Rachel and Joseph in the rear. And he himself went on ahead. And he bowed down to the ground 7 times as he approached his brother. So previously, Jacob was tucked way back in the back with a bunch of human shields up here, but not anymore. Today, Jacob is at the front of his family, leading his family head on the way he should be. And when he finally meets Esau, it's not to fight, and it's not to deceive, and it's not to hoodwink. It's to bow. Not just once, but 7 times. It's this complete act of humility and submission that he comes before his brother with. This is a very different man than the one we saw previously. Keep reading. Look at verse 4. It says, "But Esau ran to meet Jacob and embraced him. He threw his arms around his neck and kissed him, and they wept. And then Esau looked up and saw the woman and children. 'Who are these with you?' he asked. And Jacob answered, 'They are the children God graciously given your servant.'" Jacob refers to himself as servant. Now keep in mind, this is a guy who spent his whole life trying to be the smartest guy in the room, trying to be the one on top, be the one that had the advantage, to be the one that gained and that prospered through weaseling and through deception and through dishonesty and so on. But now he says, "I am your servant." He humbles himself. before his brother. And Esau asked, as we want to skip down to verse 8, Esau asked, "What's the meaning of all these flocks and herds that I met? To find favor in your eyes, my Lord," he said. My Lord, that is a term of respect and honor. Verse 9, but Esau said, "I already have plenty, my brother. Keep what you have for yourself." "No, please," said Jacob, "if I found favor in your eyes, accept this gift from me. For to see your face is like seeing the face of God now that you have received me favorably. Please accept the present that was brought to you. For God has been gracious to me, and I have all I need." And because Jacob insisted, Esau accepted it. So Jacob comes to his brother, and he's insistent, and he's humble, and he's just generous. "I have this gift that I want to give you. God has supplied me abundantly." He's humble, and where he admits all this wealth and this prosperity came from. But there's something really interesting about this passage that we don't immediately notice or recognize. It's in verse 11. It says, "Please accept the present that was brought to you." This story was originally written in the Hebrew language, and we've translated it into English so that we can understand it because nobody wants to learn Hebrew, right? But this word that we translate as present, it's a really interesting word because it's the same word that we would also translate in other places as blessing. And that kind of puts a new spin on this story because Jacob once stole a blessing from his brother. But now he's coming before him to make amends. He's saying, "Look, I took a blessing from you once upon a time, but now I want to give you a blessing. I want to bury this hatchet." He humbles himself. He extends the olive branch, and he takes the first step, and he says, I don't want to have this friction between us anymore. It's a really incredible story. And here's the takeaway. If we want to be the guy on top, if we want to have the advantage, if we want to be in control, we want to be in power, if we want to be the guy that wins, all right, it will only perpetuate and cause friction in our relationships, in our family, to say the least. That's the story of Jacob's whole first half of his life. He was that guy, and it only served to alienate the people he loved. But if we really want to heal, if we really want to reconcile with the people in our lives, with our family, it will require an entirely different posture. It will require us to be humble, to take that first step, even though we may not feel like we need to extend that olive branch, even though we may not feel like the ones who have really perpetrated the biggest offense. It will require us to be humble enough to take a step back and to say, you know what? I may not be 100% innocent in this story. Whether we had this big offense like Jacob or we had this small offense like Esau, we probably had a role to play. And if we want to heal this friction, it will require somebody, namely the people of God, to take a step forward and say, I don't want this in our life anymore. What's it going to take to make things right? Humility is key to reconciling relationships. And that really shouldn't surprise us because that's been the message that God has been giving us since the beginning. And it's epitomized in the story of Jesus. God has demonstrated the power of humility through the power of the gospel story. He demonstrated the significance of humility in this story of Jesus. I mean, you think about this story, why we're even gathered here today. It's because if we wanted to understand family friction, all we needed to do was look in the mirror. Every one of us had caused friction in our relationship with God through what we had done. Whether it was a big thing like Jacob, where we deceived and we lied and we cheated, or like Esau, we were aggressive or angry and came to blows. Maybe it was something else entirely. We all found this really creative way to alienate ourselves from God. And yet He's the one that pursued us. Not because He had to, but because He wanted to, because He loved us. He humbled Himself. He said, I'm not going to let my righteousness and I'm not going to let my authority and my position keep me from pursuing these people whom I love. He humbled Himself. And He sent Christ into this world. And even that was a tremendous act of humility because you think about who Jesus was. We read in the book of Philippians chapter 2 that He was equal with God in every way, in power and authority and honor and praise and so on. And yet He stepped into this world and He put on flesh and He lived with all the constraints of mortality. You ever stop to think about what that transition would have been like going from heaven to earth? How many of you are indoorsy kinds of people? You like air conditioning. That's me. Some guys are outdoorsy. I'm more of a Jacob. I like air conditioning. I'm inside. And I like to think of it like this. You ever been in a room with the AC on and it feels perfect? Like it's just that right temperature. You feel refreshed and energized. And then you step out your front door on an August day when the humidity is like 1,000%, and you just feel like you hit a wall of moisture, and your whole body just says, this is the worst. You've been there before? I kind of think that's what it would be like going from heaven to earth, just on an exponentially larger level. And yet Jesus chose to do this. He chose to put on limitation, and he chose to walk with the limitations of flesh. And ultimately, he chose to lay down his own life so that we could be saved. Not because he had to, not because somebody forced him to, but because he willingly said, I will pursue these people to heal this broken relationship with our Father. I will make it possible for them to come home through the work of my blood on the cross. The whole gospel story is a story of humility from beginning to end. God shows us what this looks like. He shows us how powerful humility is. He shows us the healing and reconciliatory power of humility. Man, that's a hard word to say. It's humility from beginning to end. It requires somebody to take the first step and to say, let's make this right. It is a powerful posture to assume if we want to heal family friction in our lives. And I want to encourage us in this room, because I know some of us, I know your family stories, I know your histories, and I know when I say family friction, you're going through some stuff right now. And I want to encourage you to practice humility in these relationships, to take a step back for a moment and ask the hard question, do I have some blame to bear here? It's a lot easier just to say, it's all Uncle Ted's fault. Man, he's the one that just ruined this whole thing. That's the easy option, but that may not be the truth. The truth is, if we humble ourselves and ask this question, we may see, you know what, maybe I could have handled things differently. And I want to encourage you to practice that humility of taking the first step and offering the olive branch and trying to practice the healing power of humility in your life. But I know there's some of us in here this morning, too, that we feel this friction between us and God. We feel like there's some obstacle, some gap between us, like there's something standing in the way. And I want you to know that's because there is. It's called sin. It's this choice that we made to run away from him and rebel against him. But that's not what God desires of us. He doesn't desire there to be friction and distance and obstacles between us. He sent his son into this world to alleviate all of that, to heal this relationship. And my encouragement to you this morning would be embrace that gift. Humble yourself before God and say, I need the power of Jesus in my life. I need the healing that only he can bring. I need him to wash me clean of my sin like only he can do, because he is my only hope. And when we humble ourselves before God in that way, he delivers in a powerful way. He renews us and restores us and fills us with his Spirit, and our relationship with him is healed. Whatever your situation this morning, I want to encourage you to take that step and to practice reconciliation through humility. Let's pray. Father, we thank you for today, and we thank you for the opportunity just to say yes to you. You have set for us an example of humility and the healing power of that posture, not just in Jacob, but in Jesus. We are the ones that were healed through his humble work, and we are the ones that have been restored through his death on the cross. And I pray that in the footsteps of Jesus, we would live likewise, that we would follow that path, that we would practice humility, that we might be restored the way that Jacob and Esau were restored, the way that that family was brought back together through this power and through this work. God, I pray that family really would be a blessing. I know sometimes it's hard, but I pray that you would work on our hearts and our minds to do whatever is necessary to go as far as we can go to promote peace and truth. And through all of this love and through all of this action, Father, you might be seen, that your love might be experienced, that the difference that Jesus makes might be witnessed, and that people would praise you because of the healing power of your work. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.